There are moments in a town's memory that get told wrong for so many years, the wrongness starts to feel like truth. This is not one of those stories. This is the one where the truth finally caught up. In the autumn of 1897, a woman with a single silver dollar in her coat pocket, and a dog with a coat the color of a new penny, walked up to the courthouse steps in the dying railroad town of Hollow Bend and bought a building nobody else wanted. She had lost her home 3 weeks before. She had lost her husband's name on a bank ledger before that. All she had left in the world was that dollar, a wagon of second-hand goods, and a dog who would not stop staring at the tallest pipe in a dead man's organ shop. The whole town laughed. They called her a fool for spending her last coin on silence, on dust, on a workshop that hadn't made a sound in 11 years. They did not know yet what the silence was hiding. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Adeline Marsh and her faithful dog Copper. If you have ever been laughed out of a room for believing in something everyone else had given up on, or if you've ever found a fortune hiding in the most overlooked corner of your life, tell us in the comments below. We'd love to hear where your treasure was found. To understand why Adeline Marsh walked into that courthouse with her chin lifted, despite the whispers trailing her like crows behind a plow, you have to understand what Hollow Bend had already taken from her. 2 years earlier, she had been Adeline Foss, wife of a cattle feed merchant named Elias Foss, mistress of a handsome clapboard house on Larkspur Street, with lace curtains she had sewn herself by lamplight. Elias was not a cruel man, but he was a careless one, and carelessness in matters of money can wound as deep as cruelty when the reckoning finally comes. He had signed notes he didn't understand with men who understood them very well. When the influenza took him in the winter of 1895, it did not take his debts along with him. It left them behind for Adeline, sitting at the kitchen table like an uninvited guest who intended to stay. She sold the piano first, then the china her mother had carried from Ohio in a hay-packed crate. Then, one gray March morning, the bankman came with his ledger and his apologetic mustache, and told her the house itself would have to go. She did not cry in front of him. She waited until his buggy had rattled out of earshot, and then she sat down on the porch steps she would no longer own, and wept into the fur of a half-grown copper-colored dog someone had left tied to her gatepost the winter before, a stray with one ear that folded wrong, and eyes that watched her the way a person watches someone they've already decided to love. She had named him Copper for his coat, and kept him though she could barely keep herself, and in the 2 years since, he had never once looked at her the way the town had begun to, like a cautionary tale walking upright. Hollow Bend was the kind of town that remembers a woman's misfortune longer than it remembers a man's mistake. The wives at the mercantile lowered their voices when Adeline passed, though not low enough. The shopkeepers extended less credit to a widow than they had to her husband, though her husband was the one who'd earned the debt. She took in mending. She took in laundry that left her knuckles cracked and bleeding in the cold months. She sold preserves at the depot to travelers who never learned her name. 28 years old, and already the town had decided what kind of story she was. A sad one, a small one, a warning mothers might someday tell their daughters about marrying too trustingly. There had been a courtship once, brief and awkward, from a widower named Hollis Grange, who owned the feed store 2 doors down from where her husband's old business used to stand. He meant well enough, in his blunt way, and he told her plainly one evening on her rented porch, that a woman in her situation would do well to remarry quickly, before the town's patience for her hard luck ran out entirely. She had thanked him for his honesty, and declined. And though she never regretted it, she had walked back inside that night, and sat a long while with her hand resting on Copper's back, wondering whether stubbornness was a virtue, or simply the only thing she had left to be proud of. The dog had leaned his full weight against her that night, the way he always did, when her shoulders dropped, patient and warm, asking nothing, offering everything, and she had come to depend on that small steady comfort, more than she liked to admit to anyone, even herself. Money, in those years, was a thing measured in inches rather than dollars. How far a sack of flour could be stretched, how many times a dress could be turned and re-hemmed before it had to be given up entirely, how many candles could be saved by going to bed with the sun. She grew practiced at a particular kind of arithmetic that had nothing to do with numbers. Which debts could wait another month, which humiliations could be endured for the sake of a roof, which of the town's slights were worth answering, and which were better absorbed in silence, like rain into dry ground. Copper never once seemed to notice the difference between the woman she had been on Larkspur Street and the woman she'd become in the rented room above the milliner's shop, and there were nights she thought that dog's steady, undiscriminating loyalty was the only proof she had left that she was still, underneath it all, the same person. What the town did not know was that Adeline had inherited something from her father besides his stubbornness, an eye for value where other people saw only ruin. He had been a wheelwright, and he'd taught her, in the years before consumption took him too, that a broken thing was not the same as a worthless thing, that most people threw away far more good than they kept. She carried that lesson through every hard winter like a coal banked low in a stove, waiting for kindling. The kindling came in the form of a notice pinned to the courthouse board, the estate of the late Mr. Thaddeus Renner, organ builder, to be sold at auction, contents and building both, on account of no living heirs, and unpaid taxes owed to the county. Renner had been a strange, solitary man, the kind Hollow Ben told stories about without ever quite knowing him, said to have built pipe organs for churches as far away as St. Louis before his hands grew too unsteady and his mind, some said, grew stranger still. He had died alone in his workshop 2 winters before Adeline lost her house, and the building had sat boarded and silent ever since. Weeds climbing its window ledges, its sign faded to a ghost of gold lettering nobody bothered to read anymore. Curiosity Bridge. Adeline would later say that from the very first afternoon, she stood outside Renner's shuttered shop. Something about the tallest pipe visible through a broken slat of the window told her this building had one more secret to give the town before it gave up its silence for good, though it would be weeks before she understood just how right she was. The auction itself was a small, mean little theater of a thing, held on the courthouse steps on a cold Tuesday, with maybe a dozen townsfolk in attendance, more out of boredom than interest. Nobody wanted Renner's shop. The building needed a new roof. The old organ pipes inside were rumored cursed by children who dared each other to peer through the windows at night. The county assessor, a heavy-set man named Pruitt, who fancied himself important, read off the terms in a bored drone, and looked genuinely startled when a voice rang out from the back of the small crowd. $1, Adeline said. Laughter rippled through the gathered townsfolk, quick and unkind. Old Mrs. Talbot, who ran the boarding house, murmured something behind her glove to her neighbor that made them both smirk. Pruitt himself smiled the way a man smiles when he thinks he's about to enjoy a joke at someone else's expense. "You're bidding $1, Mrs. Foss? On a building with a leaking roof and a dead man's junk inside it?" "I am," Adeline said, and she did not let her voice shake, though her hands, hidden in the folds of her worn coat, were trembling. Copper sat pressed against her skirts, ears up, gaze fixed not on the crowd but on the building itself, as though he had already heard something none of the rest of them could. Nobody else bid, not because $1 was too rich a price for anyone else to beat, but because nobody else wanted it at any price. Pruitt banged his little gavel more out of impatience than ceremony and told her the shop was hers, and half the crowd was still chuckling as they dispersed down the street, already composing the story they would tell over supper that night. The widow Foss, so far gone in her grief and her poverty, that she'd spent her last coin on a dead man's dust. She did not correct them. She had learned, in 2 hard years, that explaining yourself to people who have already decided your story is a waste of breath better spent elsewhere. She simply took the key from Pruitt's outstretched hand, felt its cold iron weight settle into her palm like a promise, and walked toward the shop with Copper trotting ahead of her, tail low and serious, nose working the air the way it did before a storm. The door stuck from disuse, swollen with 2 winters of damp, and it took her shoulder and both hands to force it open. When it finally gave, the smell that rolled out to meet her was not the smell of rot she had braced for. It was old pine and beeswax, and the faint metallic tang of tin and lead pipe, a smell like a church on a Sunday morning, that had somehow been bottled up and left to steep for years. Dust hung suspended in the shaft of gray afternoon light from the doorway, turning slowly, undisturbed, and there, filling nearly the entire back wall of the workshop, stood the half-finished skeleton of a pipe organ, dozens of pipes of every size, marching up in ranks, like a silent choir waiting for a hymn that had never come, and towering above them all, nearly touching the rafters, one pipe taller and broader than any of the rest, capped at the top with a disc of hammered tin that did not quite match the others. Copper would not go near the workbenches, would not sniff at the neat rows of tools still hanging exactly where Renner had left them. He went straight to the tallest pipe and sat before it, and whined, not a frightened whine, but a low, urgent sound Adeline had never heard him make before, a sound with a question folded inside it. That night, she slept in the shop, rather than the room she was renting above the milliner's, wrapped in a horse blanket on a cot she found in Renner's back room, because something in her would not let her leave the building unattended, though she could not have said why. Copper lay across the threshold like a sentry, lifting his head at every creak of settling wood, and twice in the night he rose and paced back to the tallest pipe and pressed his nose against its base, before returning, unsettled, to lie beside her. In the days that followed, word spread through Hollow Bend of what the widow Foss had done, and the story grew unkinder with each retelling, as such stories do. She was mad with grief, some said. She meant to live in that shop like a hermit, others said, too proud to admit she had nowhere else to go. The Reverend's wife suggested, not unkindly, but not kindly either, that perhaps a woman alone oughtn't be spending her days in a dead bachelor's workshop at all. Adeline heard every version, filtered back to her through the mercantile clerk, who couldn't help repeating gossip, and she said nothing, because she had already begun to understand that the shop held something worth more than the town's good opinion, if only she could puzzle out what it was. The workshop, once she had beaten back the worst of its dust, revealed itself to be a place of real and quiet beauty, the kind that only patient work leaves behind. Morning light came slanting through the tall west windows in the afternoons, catching motes of sawdust still fine enough to hang in the air though Renner had been 11 years gone, and turning the ranks of smaller pipes along the wall into 100 narrow columns of gold and dull silver. She learned to love the particular smell of the place at different hours, sharp and resinous in the cold mornings when she first unlatched the door, warmer and sweeter by midday when the sun had worked into the old pine shelving, and by evening, with the stove going, something almost like the smell of her grandmother's kitchen, beeswax and wood smoke layered one over the other. She began, without quite meaning to, talking to the shop the way lonely people talk to empty rooms, telling it about her day, asking it, half in jest, what exactly it thought it was hiding. Copper, for his part, settled into the workshop as though he had always belonged there, save for the one persistent exception. He found a favorite patch of sun beneath the west window, where he would doze through the slow hours while Adeline worked, and he took to greeting the handful of curious children who pressed their faces to the newly cleaned glass with a wagging tail rather than the growl she half expected from a dog so protective of his person. But every single day, at some point before the light failed, he would rise from his patch of sun, cross the workshop floor with his claws clicking against the swept boards, and return to his post before the tallest pipe, sitting with an attentiveness that looked, to Adeline's eye, less like curiosity, and more like waiting, as if he understood, in whatever way a dog understands such things, that something inside that column of tin and wood had been waiting a very long time to be found, and meant to see the waiting through to its end. She began, in those first days, cataloging Renner's tools and stock the way a careful woman does when she means to make an honest inventory of what she owns, in case the county or anyone else should ever ask. It was slow, absorbing work, and it gave her hands something useful to do while her mind turned over the mystery of the tallest pipe from every angle she could manage. She measured it against its neighbors, and found it taller by nearly 1.5 feet, though the drawings she eventually found suggested no organ of Renner's design called for a pipe of such unusual height. She noted, too, that where the other pipes bore small stamped marks identifying their pitch and their place in the instrument's eventual voicing, the tallest pipe bore no mark at all, as though Renner had deliberately left it unclaimed by the rest of the design, a stranger standing at the back of a family portrait. She began cleaning the place from the front door back, partly from practicality, and partly, she admitted to herself, to put off the moment she'd have to face that tallest pipe, and whatever had Copper so unsettled. She swept 2 years of dust from the floorboards, and found them to be good oak beneath the grime, tight-grained and unwarped. She oiled the workbenches, and found Renner's tools, still sharp, still true, laid out with the meticulous care of a man who had loved his craft even in his loneliness. She found ledgers in a drawer, columns of careful figures documenting commissions from churches in 3 states, and beneath the ledgers, tucked almost as an afterthought, a single folded letter addressed to no one, written in a hand that grew shakier toward the end, speaking of a great work he meant to finish before his hands failed him entirely, a work he called his Cathedral Voice. Curiosity Bridge. It was that phrase, Cathedral Voice, scrawled in Renner's failing hand, that Adeline would carry with her for the rest of that week, like a splinter she couldn't quite work free, certain it meant something far larger than a dead man's private grief over unfinished work, though the true shape of what he'd hidden was still beyond anything she could have imagined. She did not have money for lumber, or glass, or a new roof. What she had was time, stubbornness, and a growing conviction, born of her father's old lessons, that a shop this carefully built by a craftsman this skilled, had not been abandoned so completely by accident. Renner had sealed things away in his life. Perhaps he had sealed something away in his shop as well. The dog would not let her forget the tallest pipe. Every single day, without fail, Copper made his pilgrimage to its base, sat, and looked up its towering length with an expression that Adeline, who had come to read every flicker of his face the way other women read scripture, could only describe as reverent. When she finally worked up the courage, and the latter, to examine the pipe's tin-cap top more closely, Copper did not merely watch. He rose onto his hind legs against the ladder's base, front paws scrabbling at the wood, tail beating an anxious rhythm against the floor, and when she called down to him to hush, he let out a single sharp bark that echoed off the rafters like a shot, the only bark she had heard from him since she'd bought the place, as though he could no longer contain what his nose already knew. The disc of tin at the pipe's crown was not, she realized as her fingers traced its edge, original to the instrument at all. It had been added, soldered on with less skill than the rest of Renner's exacting work, as if placed in haste, or in secrecy, or both. Beneath her palm, she could feel that the pipe's usual thinness gave way here to something denser, something that did not ring hollow the way a proper organ pipe should when she rapped her knuckles against its side. It rang instead with the dull, muffled thud of something packed full. She climbed down that evening with her pulse loud in her own ears, and did not sleep at all, and in the gray hour before dawn, with Copper pressed so tightly against her side, she could feel his heart beating nearly as fast as her own. Adeline Marsh, for she had begun, in her own mind, to shed the name Foss, along with everything else the town had taken from her, decided that whatever Thaddeus Renner had hidden inside that tallest pipe, she would find it, whatever it cost her. What it very nearly cost her, was everything she had left, because prying loose a soldered cap 11 feet in the air, with nothing but a dead man's tools, was no small undertaking for a woman working alone. It took her 3 days of careful, patient labor, heating the old solder gently with a tinsmith's iron she found among Renner's things, easing the disc free a fraction of an inch at a time, so as not to crush whatever lay inside. Copper stood sentinel at the base of the ladder the entire time, and when the disc finally came loose with a soft groan of old metal, and Adeline lifted it away, he let out a sound she had never heard from any dog before or since. Not a bark, not a whine, but something almost like a sigh of relief, as though a burden he had been carrying in his own chest for weeks had finally been set down. Inside the pipe, wrapped in oilcloth gone stiff and yellow with age, she found a bundle bound with waxed twine. Her hands shook so badly climbing down the ladder that she nearly dropped it twice, and she did not open it until she was sitting on the workshop floor with Copper's warm weight pressed against her, as though even he understood the moment called for steadiness. Inside the oilcloth, a stack of drawings, meticulous architectural plans in Renner's own hand for a grand cathedral organ, his cathedral voice, the great unfinished work of his letter, along with a folded document bearing the seal of a diocese in St. Louis, and beneath that, wrapped in a second layer of cloth, a small leather pouch heavy enough to make her breath catch when she lifted it. Inside the pouch, gold coin, old and dull with age, and a note in Renner's shaking hand, explaining that the commission for the great cathedral organ had been paid to him in advance, in full, by a bishop who trusted his reputation, payment Renner had never been able to complete the work to earn, and had hidden away out of a lonely guilty man's shame at having taken money for a masterpiece his failing hands could no longer build. He had meant, the note said, to return it. He had simply run out of time. It was, by the standards of Hollow Bend, a genuine fortune. enough gold to rebuild a dozen houses, enough to erase every debt Elias Foss had ever signed his careless name to twice over. And it was here that Hollow Ben's story about the widow Foss began, quietly at first and then all at once, to fall apart. Word of Adeline's discovery could not stay contained in a town as small and hungry for gossip as Hollow Bend, and it was not 3 days before Silas Pruitt, the same county assessor who had banged his gavel with such amused impatience at her $1 bid, came calling at the shop with a lawyer from the county seat trailing behind him, and a great deal of confidence in his step. He had convinced himself, and was working hard to convince the town, that whatever had been found inside a building sold at a tax auction rightfully belonged not to the buyer, but to the county that had sold it. That Adeline's dollar had purchased a shop and its ordinary contents, not whatever hidden treasure a dead man happened to have squirreled away inside the walls. He said the word treasure with a particular curl of his lip, as though the very idea of a woman like her possessing something valuable was an affront to the natural order. What made Pruitt's opposition sting sharper than simple greed was the history between them that the whole town half remembered, and Adeline remembered whole. It had been Pruitt's bank, 2 years before, that had foreclosed on her Larkspur Street house with what she'd always felt was more relish than regulation required. Pruitt, who had stood at her gate with his ledger and his apologetic mustache that had not, in fact, been apologetic at all once you looked closely at his eyes. He had profited handsomely from her fall, taking a fee for handling the estate sale of her furniture, and now here he was again, standing in the doorway of the one good thing that had happened to her since, determined to take this from her too. The auction was final, Adeline told him, and to her own surprise, her voice did not shake this time. The notice posted at the courthouse said contents and building both. I have the receipt in your own hand. Contents, Pruitt said, means Renner's tools, and his lumber, not a bishop's gold hidden away like a squirrel's nut. The county will want its share, Mrs. Foss, and I dare say the diocese in St. Louis will want theirs as well, once they learn of it. It was a threat, wrapped in legal language, and everyone in the room understood it as one, including Copper, who had risen from his place by the stove the moment Pruitt's voice sharpened, and now stood between the man and Adeline with his hackles raised, and a low growl building in his chest, a sound of pure protective fury that Adeline had never once heard from her gentle, steady dog. Pruitt took an involuntary step back toward the door, and for the first time since she'd known him, Adeline saw something like uncertainty cross his face. Curiosity Bridge, what Pruitt did not know, standing in that doorway with his borrowed confidence draining away under the dog's steady growl, was that Adeline had already spent 3 sleepless nights reading every line of Renner's diocesan contract by lamplight, and buried in its careful legal phrasing was a detail that would turn his entire claim to dust. That detail, once Adeline found it and confirmed it with a lawyer of her own, a young hungry attorney from 2 towns over, named Ezra Whitcomb, who took her case on the promise of a fee once the matter was settled, rather than before, because he too had grown tired of watching Hollow Ben's powerful men take what wasn't theirs, was this. The diocese's contract with Renner specified plainly that should the organ builder die before completing the commissioned work, the advance payment, and all materials purchased with it, would revert entirely to the estate of the builder, to be disposed of at the estate's discretion, with no further claim by the diocese. Renner, in his loneliness and his shame, had never told anyone the payment existed at all, which meant the diocese had never formally pursued its return, and the estate, sold whole, contents included, for $1, at a legally noticed county auction, now belonged, gold and all, to Adeline Marsh. Pruitt did not accept defeat gracefully. He tried, in the weeks that followed, every lever a small-town official could pull, questioning the validity of the auction itself, suggesting to the town council that the widow Foss had somehow known about the gold beforehand and defrauded the county of its rightful tax revenue, even attempting, in his most desperate hour, to have the sheriff seize the workshop's contents, pending an investigation that existed nowhere but in his own wounded pride. He called on old alliances too, men who owed him favors from years of quiet dealings at the bank, and for a few uneasy days, it seemed as though the whole weight of Hollow Ben's respectable establishment might tip against her, simply because Pruitt willed it so loudly and so often. Whitcomb warned her plainly that men like Pruitt rarely lost gracefully, and that she should brace herself for a fight uglier than the one she'd already weathered. It was in those uneasy days that the town's mood, which had been curious and half-mocking, began to curdle into something closer to suspicion, stoked deliberately by Pruitt's whispered asides at the mercantile and the barber shop. A few of the more credulous townsfolk began to wonder aloud whether the widow Foss hadn't known about Renner's hidden gold all along, whether her $1 bid had been less foolishness than calculation. Adeline felt the shift keenly, felt the same cold appraising looks she remembered from the worst of her grief now aimed at her for the opposite reason, as though prosperity, like poverty before it, had to be some kind of moral failing in a woman the town had never quite decided how to categorize. But Whitcomb was sharper than Pruitt had bargained for, and the diocesan letter, once its contents became known, told a story even Hollow Bend's most stubborn gossips could not twist into anything but the plain truth: a lonely craftsman's honest shame, a widow's honest diligence, and a county official's dishonest greed. It was Copper, in the end, who settled the matter in the court of public opinion, if not the court of law. On the day the sheriff arrived with Pruitt's paperwork, to formally inventory the shop's contents, pending the council's decision, Copper positioned himself before the tallest pipe, now standing empty and open, its secret already given up, and would not be moved, would not be coaxed, would not stop his low steady growl, until the sheriff, a practical man named Coates, who had no appetite for Pruitt's vendetta, and even less for being bitten, suggested they simply wait for the council's ruling like reasonable people, and left the gold exactly where Adeline had locked it in Renner's old strongbox. The council ruling, when it came 3 weeks later, was unanimous in Adeline's favor, and it came with a coda nobody in Hollow Bend had expected. Buried in the same investigation that Pruitt had demanded, the council's own auditor discovered irregularities in Pruitt's handling of 2 other estate sales over the previous 4 years, discrepancies between what properties had fetched at auction and what the county's books actually showed, money that had apparently found its way into accounts bearing Pruitt's own name rather than the county's. The man who had spent a month insisting Adeline Marsh had stolen from the public trust was removed from his post within the week, his own careful ledgers, ironically, the very thing that condemned him. Adeline did not gloat, though the town, having flipped its allegiance with the same speed it had once flipped its scorn, would gladly have gloated on her behalf. Instead, she did something that surprised even those who thought they'd finally understood her. She used a portion of Renner's gold to pay off the last of the diocese's goodwill by finishing, with the help of 2 journeyman organ builders she brought in from St. Louis, the cathedral organ Renner had died unable to complete. His cathedral voice, built at last, and shipped east the following spring to sing in a church he had never lived to hear it fill. She used another portion to quietly settle the debts of 3 other Hollow Bend families, who had fallen on hard times, not unlike her own. Families the town had been just as quick to whisper about, as they'd once whispered about her, asking nothing in return, but that the money be called a loan repaid rather than charity given, so that no one need feel the sting of pity she remembered so well. And she kept the workshop itself, reopening it, not as an organ builder's shop, but as what it had somehow always wanted to be underneath all that silence and dust: a gathering place, a workroom, a small library of Renner's own careful drawings that any child in Hollow Bend, curious about how a pipe organ makes its voice, could come and study, free of charge, so long as they wiped their boots and treated the tools with respect. The town that had once laughed at a widow's $1 bid began, slowly, and without much grace about it, to tell a different story. Not of a fool who'd wasted her last coin on dust, but of a woman who had seen value where everyone else saw ruin, and a dog who had known, from the very first afternoon, exactly where to look. We think about Adeline Marsh sometimes, and about Copper, standing his ground before a pipe organ's tallest, quietest voice until the whole town finally learned to listen. It makes us wonder how much overlooked value is sitting right now in the corners of our own lives, waiting only for someone patient enough, and stubborn enough, to notice it. If you found a hidden piece of history sealed away and forgotten, would you keep it for yourself, or would you share it the way Adeline chose to? We'd love to hear your answer below. Until next time, stay close.